train up a child in the way he should go. I think you can all complete the text, can't you? And when he is old, he will not depart from it. There we've got, as so often happens in the scriptures, a command and a promise. The command is, train up a child in the way he should go. And the promise is, he'll be a success. When he is old, he will not depart from it. Even many Christian denominations, the Roman Catholic Church, for instance, will say, give me a child till he's 7 years of age and he'll be a Catholic all his life. And that shows to us the importance of early training. People like to say, well, of course, he's only young yet or she's only young yet. When he begins to understand a few things, and when I can talk to him, then he'll be better. He'll begin to mend his ways. But you know, it's already getting dangerously too late, even at that stage. Train up a child when we're planting some small shrub or plant. When do we begin to train it? From the word go, don't we? And we want to train it in the way it ought to go. So it is of all things with children. And incidentally, it comments in the spirit of prophecy that the text says, train up and not tell. There's a difference, isn't there? Train up a child in the way he should go. Don't just tell the child the way he should go. And if we are to do some training up, what is necessary on our part in our own lives? We are to set the example. The things we tell to others must be backed up in our own lives. Oh yes, Satan will try to blacken our lives in the eyes of others. He will try to pervert the standards and the principles that we're standing for, and reduce our influence before our children and before others. But we are to conscientiously look to Jesus and accept all the things that he wants us to do, and then and only then shall we be qualified to train up a child in the way he should go. Not just a question of do as I, what is it? Do as I say, but not as I do. It's a question of do as I do. And you know, it's amazing how quickly children can suss it out as to whether we're really at the back of what we're saying, heart and soul, whether it really is carried out and practiced in our own lives. They're far more attentive than we may think. And there's another text here in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26. Text we all know quite well. It says, and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. That's the principle upon which God created man. Now here's the relationship upon which God created the beasts. It says, let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, fowl of the air, cattle, over all the earth, and every creeping thing that creepeth on the earth. There is a difference between the animal creation and man. But you know, I think there are a large number of people in our world who give more attention to training their dog than they do their children. And you know, how carefully we should consider not just the things we're saying to the children, but the things that we are doing before them. The influence we impart, the happiness and tranquility that should be in our hearts if we want to see it reflected in them. Train up a child. You know, so many people say, well, I did train him up and look how he's gone. I sent him to Sunday school, and I sent him to Sabbath school, and I let so-and-so have a talk with him. There's a tremendous amount more in training up a child than doing just that. It is a day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute business in our relationship with a child. And who are the main educators of the child? Today, we immediately think of the Ministry of Education or something, don't we? But the schools are really, as the saying goes, they're the Johnny-come-lately in education. They've only been going in education, the state schools in particular, for 100 or so years. Prior to that, well, it was a church school for a few centuries. And prior to that, it was the home, the family, the parents. They were the educators of the children. Who educated Jesus? His own mother. And God trusted his mother to educate him. We're told in the spirit of prophecy, had he gone to the schools of the rabbis, he would have been ruined. And those were the honoured and respected educational institutions of the day. He was trained simply and humbly at his mother's knee, and as we're told in Desire of Ages, as he grew, he studied for himself the Scriptures. It says that he knew the Scriptures from beginning to end. That was the training that Jesus had. And what a mighty man of God it made him. The same kind of treatment, the same kind of training John the Baptist had. He was in the wilderness, as we're told, until his showing unto Israel. And when he was shown unto Israel, he really, by God's grace, moved Israel and stirred them with his great messages of calling to God and calling to repentance. In the wilderness as he was. These are examples of children who were trained up and educated as God would have. Yes, the beast of the field offers us an entirely different proposition in training than does the child. Why? Because the beast of the field has not got a will of his own, and a child has. A child has the power of decision that has been endowed upon him. The beast merely has the power to do as his master tells him. An entirely different situation. Just take a look at Psalm 32, verses 8 and 9. Psalm 32, verses 8 and 9. It says here, I will instruct thee and teach thee in the way that thou shalt go. This is how a child, this is how a human being is to be trained. By instruction and teaching. Precept and example. This is the thing that matters. Oh, so many pass on and learn by bitter experience. That can be avoided. Attention to precept and example. I will instruct thee in the way that thou shouldest go. This is the thing that matters. This is the thing that will save us many a heartache, many a catastrophe. The righteous, the wise, taketh heed, but the foolish pass on and are punished. And it goes on to say in verse 9, be ye not as the horse or as the mule, which have no understanding, whose mouth must be held in with bit and bridle, lest they come near unto thee. And yet, how many potential human beings are trained with no more consideration or even less than the horse or the mule. I will instruct thee how thou shouldest go. That is the issue. Let me read to you from child guidance. I shall be referring to this in our talk this afternoon a few times. Child guidance, page 39. It says here, the training of children must be conducted on a different principle than that which governs the training of irrational animals. The brute has only to be accustomed to submit to its master, but the child must be taught to control himself. The will must be trained to obey the dictates of reason and conscience. This is the training of a child. I'll read that again. The child must be taught to control himself, and the will must be trained to obey the dictates of reason and conscience. A child may be so disciplined as to have, like the beast, no will of his own, his individuality being lost in that of his teacher. That's all wrong. Faithful teaching in Christ will lead a man or a child to render intelligent, willing obedience, loving obedience, not fearful obedience, not dog-like devotion, as the saying goes. Oh no. The child must be taught to give loving obedience. What is it that makes men, in God's sight, jewels? It is the fact that they have learned to submit their will lovingly and willingly to God. But you know, oh so often, a child will need to submit his will lovingly and obediently to his parents before ever he can begin thinking at a later age of obeying God. And it says here, children thus educated, that's by being told and firmly instructed without intelligent understanding of what they're doing, children thus educated will be deficient in firmness and decision. They are not taught to act from principle. The reasoning powers are not strengthened by exercise. Now it is true that there are occasions when a child has to obey without fully understanding why. Sometimes that occurs in our relationship with God, doesn't it? We do what He calls upon us to do in His Word without fully understanding why sometimes. But as time goes on, we begin to realize the reason why. But really, the Lord wants us to live so closely to Him, just as a child can live so closely to us, as that child understands what's in our heart and intelligently cooperates and obeys. This is imperative. How can anyone be saved in the kingdom of God? How can a child be saved in the kingdom of God without this intelligent, willing cooperation and obedience? In Malachi chapter 4 and verses 5 and 6, there is a challenge laid down. The closing two verses in the Old Testament. And in them, we're pointed to this very day in which we live. Let me read them. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of what? The great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. We know that this prophecy of Malachi's was partially fulfilled at the advent of John the Baptist. Jesus himself pointed out that he was a fulfillment of Elijah the prophet. But he was not the complete fulfillment by any means, because it says here that he would send Elijah the prophet when? Before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. That's the very day in which we ourselves are living. God has sent his prophet to the Advent movement in the spirit and power of Elijah. Faithful Adventists are echoing and re-echoing the precious truths that God has communicated to his last day prophet. And what is the outstanding effect of that testimony that Jesus has given? It says it will turn the heart of the fathers to the children and the children to the fathers. It will promote a beautiful unity between father and child. This is the object of God's last message. This is the effect that it's going to have. We're talking this weekend on character development, aren't we? It's ever so important. But this indeed is a vital part of it, that we should understand it, isn't it? We want to be ready to meet Jesus. Child training is a vital part of that preparation. And to understand it in the fear of God is ever so ever important. Let me read to you again from Child Guidance, page 276 this time. Says, the wickedness which exists in the world today may be traced to the neglect of parents to discipline themselves and their children. Notice how it doesn't say the neglect of parents to discipline their children. It says the neglect of parents to discipline themselves and their children. Thousands upon thousands of Satan's victims are what they are because of the injudicious way in which they were managed during their childhood. The stern rebuke of God is upon this mismanagement. In fact, here in Malachi it says that the heart of the parents and the children need to be turned towards one another, lest what? Lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. And here it says, the stern rebuke of God is upon this mismanagement. If ever there was a time in the history of the world when this message needs to go, it is now. We believe that if ever there was a time when the Sabbath message needed to go, because of the prevalence of the doctrine of evolution in every man's mind practically, it's now. But here is another vital truth that has got to go here and now to turn the heart of the parents to the children, etc. How should we begin our course with God in fulfilling this commission? A commission specially allotted to the Advent people, who above all people should be outstanding in the training of their children. Well, if you read Judges 13, I'll not suggest you turn to it now. It's the story of the... See if that was enough to get you to turn to it, wasn't it? I see a few of you are turning to it, but it's the story of Mr. and Mrs. Manoah and their child-to-be, Samson. And as you read that chapter, it outlines very thoroughly the importance of not just training a child from birth. As I say, most people think you only start training a child when you send him to school or something. You don't even start training a child at his birth. It's prenatal influences that are talked about here, isn't it? the self-control and the character of parents, both parents, yes, particularly the mother, but also the father, is being impressed upon that child even before he's born. How important that training starts, not just with children, but with ourselves. And here, in Patriarchs and Prophets, it tells us about this. Page 561. The inquiry of every father and mother should be, what shall we do unto the child that shall be born unto us? The effect of prenatal influences has been by many lightly regarded, but the instruction sent from heaven to those Hebrew parents, and twice repeated in the most explicit and solemn manner, shows how this matter is looked upon by our Creator. It goes on to say earlier in the page, God had an important work for the promised child of Manoah to do, and it was to secure for him the qualifications necessary for this work that the habits of both the mother and the child were to be carefully regulated. It says, the child will be affected for good or evil by the habits of the mother. She must herself be controlled by principle and must practice temperance and self-denial if she would seek the welfare of her child. Unwise advisers will urge upon the mother the necessity of gratifying every wish and impulse. But such teaching is false and mischievous. The mother is, by the command of God Himself, placed under the most solemn obligation to exercise self-control. Self-control. How do we exercise self-control? By submitting our wills to Christ, because we can't control ourselves without doing just that. Just another statement here, again in page 561 of Patriarchs and Prophets. The fathers as well as mothers are involved in this responsibility. Both parents transmit their own characteristics, mental and physical, their dispositions and appetites to their children. As the result of parental intemperance, children often lack physical strength and mental and moral powers. So there we see the importance of both parents playing a part in this. Let me read you something else now from Child Guidance. Child Guidance, page 26 this time. Says, parents send their children to school, and when they have done this, they think they have educated them. But education is a matter of greater breadth than many realize. It comprises the whole process by which the child is instructed, from babyhood to childhood, from childhood to youth, and from youth to manhood. As soon as a child is capable of forming an idea, his education should begin. It also says children should virtually be trained in a home school from the cradle to maturity. Did you hear that? This is the school that matters. Children should be trained in a home school from the cradle to maturity. And as in the case of any well-regulated school, the teachers themselves gain important knowledge. The mother especially, who is the principal teacher in the home, should there learn the most valuable lessons of her life. Children should be trained from babyhood. It's so easy to assume that a child can be dealt with later. But every day that goes by, every moment that passes, wrong traits, if they are allowed to develop, will gradually take over in the nature of that child. Training children, I think we could realize, is the same as developing a well-ordered garden. I'm not saying that there's as much skill involved in growing a nice garden as there is involved in training a child. There isn't. Nothing like so much skill required. But I think again, we as parents, if we're not careful, spend more time in getting a nice garden, and I think it's good to have a nice garden, mind you, than we do in making sure that the plants in our children's characters are weeded out. And how intelligently, how carefully, how effectively those plants can be weeded out. It can only be done by godly parents who are themselves submitted to God and understand the nature of those weeds and how they can be dealt with. We as godly parents, as we deal with those weeds, and as by the grace of God we can be effective, are going to be criticized by others. Make no mistake about that. We shall be criticized as being wrong in this way, wrong in that way. We need to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus and pursue that course, because if we do, it will be effective. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating, isn't that right? We need to just silently, perseveringly press on in the way that the Lord is guiding us. Not looking to worldly habits or worldly impressions or worldly people's comments, but looking to Jesus and looking to what he says in his word. In our homes there will be the atmosphere of heaven. You know, how many are there who have an influence in their homes on that box, for instance? It's a snake in the grass. We've never had one ourselves, and by God's grace, we never shall do. Fancy letting the devil get into your homes with his subversive propaganda. Oh, which we know there are many nice things on the TV. But it's like the tree of knowledge of good and evil. There are some nice things and some not so nice. The Word of God needs to be the rule of the home. And when I say rule, an enjoyable rule. A rule that is delighted in by the parents and children. I've got Adventist Home here, page 202. It says, eternal vigilance must be manifested with regard to our children. With his manifold devices, Satan begins to work with their tempers and their wills as soon as they're born. Take notice of that. We can't afford to allow him to steal a march on us. It is said that the successful businessman is the man who can make hay with the grass that grows under his competitors' feet. And Satan is indeed a successful businessman. He's in the business of ruining souls. He's in the business of making as many others as possible like himself. And he is very active in making hay with the grass that grows under parents' feet. How we need to make sure that that grass is not allowed to grow, that the weeds are weeded out right at the start, for make no mistake, they are surely growing. It says here, I'll read it again, with his manifold devices, Satan begins to work with their tempers and their wills as soon as they're born. Don't let's think that as they develop, they'll grow out of these things. Oh no. Oh no. The way a child is handled, the way a child is fed, all these things are having an important effect upon the character of the child. He can only understand such things as that when he's first born. It says here, their safety depends upon the wisdom and the vigilant care of the parents. They must strive in the love and fear of God to preoccupy the garden of the heart, sowing the good seeds in a right spirit, correct habits, and the love and fear of God. Make no mistake, this is an uphill battle. Satan will oppose us and cause us to be contradicted. He will endeavor to confuse us at every step we take. We need to be determined, with our will firmly under the control of conscience, in order to make sure that our lives are such that the Lord can use them. You know, it is so often the case when, you know how it says in the Spirit of Prophecy that in the majority of marriages that we experience in this world, the funeral march would be far more appropriate than the wedding march. And it is also true that in the majority of births of children, sad to say, the funeral march would be more appropriate in the majority. Terrible thing to have to think of. Terrible thing to have to say. But there are very few children who God can use and bless and guide. Very few parents who have the ability to guide them in the fear of God and to deal with their habits as they gradually develop. How important these things are. And when a child is born, godly parents will not view that child as just an object of delight, a plaything, or whatever. It's a sacred responsibility from God. When a child is born, he has placed the parents in the position of himself as creator, isn't that it? As much as possible, he's enabled us to view that child as he views a man who he has made. He's placed us in his own position. And just as our relationship to him can be wholesome and good, so the relationship of a child to us can be wholesome and good and can be very meaningful. We are in the position of the Maker. All right then. Let me turn you again now to child guidance. This time, page 92. It says here, one precious lesson which the mother will need to repeat again and again is that the child is not to rule. The household is not to be governed by the nursery. No way. And we're not to say that in a domineering way, we're to say it in a loving way. It would be a disaster, and it is a disaster in so many homes. It says, he is not the master, but her will, that's the mother's will, and her wishes are to be supreme. Thus she is teaching them self-control. What did Jesus say to his Heavenly Father? Not my will, but thy will be done. And this is to be the attitude that all children need to be taught. Not my will, but thy will. This is imperative. No man or woman who is a Christian can indulge in the attitude of my will. It's not my will, but thy will. And when it's the will of Jesus, our will is stronger than ever it would have been had it been just our will. The strength of a man's will is not the strength of passions or whatever that burst forth from him, how hard he can hit the roof or anything like that. The strength of a man's will is the strength of the passions he is able to control and direct. He is not controlled by his passions or his feelings, but he controls his passions and his feelings. That's what makes a strong man or a strong woman. And it says that she is teaching them self-control. Listen to what it says next. Give them nothing for which they cry. That's something to think about, isn't it? Now, I suppose if we see a child crying, our child, we need to make sure to start with that perhaps it isn't his napkin pin that's poking into him or something like that. But we come to understand the child, don't we? And we know the reasons that that child is crying. And if that child is crying because he's demanding something, then he's got to cry it out. And when his demand has been finished, if that demand was wholesome, then it can be given. But not while he's crying. Even if it's for his feed. You know, there are many parents see the child crying, and what do? Go and stick a dummy in his mouth. I'll keep him quiet. Or maybe they give him something, a sweetie or something like that, you know. Despite the fact that we're told we shouldn't eat between meals. Something to keep him quiet. But you know, when he wants another sweet, what's he going to do? He's going to cry for it, isn't he? What a way to train children. You know, I sat in Bible studies not long ago with one fellow. He was a good-meaning fellow, but he was completely ignorant on the way he should train his child. And he got some biscuits. And I was giving him the Bible study, and while I was giving it him, his child was playing around in the room, and he'd give a cry, break a bit off his biscuit and throw it to the child. And then the child would quieten down, and then when he'd eaten that, he wanted a bit more, so he'd start crying again. Reminded me of someone feeding the ducks. But, you know, we're to deal with children different from training animals, aren't we? We're controlling the will of the child. Give them nothing for which they cry. That is a very important rule. Don't go starting picking them up and all this sort of thing, you know. Those things are all teaching the child to demand and require things. Children who got used to demanding as they grow perhaps make good militant trade union leaders, I don't know. Demand a higher wage and all that sort of thing. But this is not the training that God's children will receive. This is not the type of life that God's children will be living. They will have gratitude in their hearts and minds continually. They will not be demanding. And these things can be trained in the child right from birth, unwittingly, by parents. But if only parents would read God's word and the spirit of prophecy, they would have the necessary wisdom to deal intelligently with their child. It says, give them nothing for which they cry. They can cry it out, and when they're finished and calm, then they can be given whatever is required, and it can be done in love. No need for a battle of wills. That should be avoided if at all possible. All right, sometimes will has to meet will, but it should be avoided if possible. Not that we want to behave in a cowardly way, but because we don't want to damage the will of the child. That will has not got to be cut down, it's got to be trained. And that's the thing that we've got to bear in mind. It says, give them nothing for which they cry, even if your tender heart desires ever so much to do this. For if they gain the victory once by crying, they will expect to do it again. And the second time, the battle will be more vehement. And the third and the fourth and the fifth and the umpteenth time will be worse still, until it is eventually ingrained in the character. And if that person, as a result, is going to be unconverted, but if that person should be converted in later life, he has a battle to face to overcome that self-will that has been trained into him. All right then. Another thing I suppose we need to bear in mind is to avoid saying no as much as possible. All right, it may have to be said occasionally, but let us avoid it as much as ever possible. You know, when children are just toddlers, if we just let them loose in a room, got little ornaments and one thing and another around in the room, and we see them making for something, what is it? No, don't touch that. No, let that alone. And so I see parents get up and they have to take the thing out of the child's hand. Oh, this is disastrous in training a child. We need to put them within the limits of their capabilities. All right? Don't put them where we're going to have to be stopping them doing this and that. Ideally, we can put them in a nursery where there's nothing to be, where they are capable of ordering themselves aright. If you haven't got a nursery, then you can perhaps use a playpen. Use a playpen. You'll be quite happy in a playpen. But if you use a playpen, don't put them down outside the playpen until you're ready to have them take on a larger responsibility. During the time they're in their playpen, they're either in their playpen, or they're in their pram, or in their high chair, or in their cot. And then when the time comes, when they can be entrusted with larger responsibilities, then give it to them. Avoid placing them under circumstances where there is a conflict of wills, where you're having to say, no, don't do this. Another rule we need to follow is never snatch anything out of their hands. Ask them for it. They've got to be taught to obey a word, a loving word. It's possible to give a thing to a child and play a little game. You give it to him, and then you say, thank you, and he'll give it you back. You get him in the habit of it. You give it him, and he'll give it you. This is a thing that these things need to be all thought out by the parents. But never snatch anything out of the child's hand or pull it out by force. Let the child give it freely and willingly. You are training a will. You're not training a mule or a horse, but you are when you snatch, aren't you? Yes, all these things are so vitally important when we say train up a child in the way he should go. When he is old, he'll have a character moulded after the similitude of Jesus. And God willing, after the similitude of us, if by God's grace we have a character like that. Let me turn you again now to child guidance, this time page 224. He who is the fountain of all knowledge has stated the condition of our fitness to enter the heaven of bliss. In the words, blessed are they that do his commandments, that they may have right to the tree of life, and may enter in through the gates into the city. Obedience to God's commandments is the price of heaven, and obedience to their parents in the Lord is the all-important lesson for children to learn: obedience. But you know, as soon as we begin to talk of obedience, so many get the idea that it's almost cruel or harsh, something that's got to be exacted. Children can be trained to enjoy obeying their parents. And this is essential. Unless a child can enjoy and lovingly obey his parents, how can he enjoy obeying God and keeping God's commandments? Can you see where the attitude that we're facing up to, even in our own church today, where it is based? The commandments, they're harsh. God's commandments, and by God's grace, parents' commandments, are very good and holy and just and loving. Something that a child can enjoy, and when he grows up, he will enjoy keeping the Lord's commandments. However can a child enjoy obeying God if he's not first been trained to enjoy obeying his parents? This is ever so important. Obedience. We sing the hymn, don't we? Trust and obey, for there is no other way to be what? Happy in Jesus. And yet Satan represents obedience as something which is harsh, exacting, and undesirable. Nothing could be farther from the truth. True loving obedience is the pathway to life. We ourselves in our churches are so often represented, aren't we, as trying to earn our salvation by our works. Our loving obedience to Jesus is being represented as Pharisaism, trying to earn salvation. Well, people who say that have got a wrong conception of what true obedience is. Isn't that so? It certainly is. Because true obedience leads us nearer to Jesus. If ye love me, says Jesus, you know the rest, don't you? Keep my commandments. All right then. While we're still here in child guidance, let me quote you another statement. Page 147 this time. This is the way we are to issue our commands. It says, pleasant, cheery words cost no more than unpleasant, moody words. Do you dislike to have harsh words spoken to you? Remember that when you speak such words, others feel the sharp sting. Parents, bring practical godliness into the home. Angels are not attracted to a home where discord reigns. Educate your children to speak words that will bring sunshine and joy. If we can be a Christian in our home, then we truly are Christians, aren't we? Because in our home, familiarity tends to breed contempt, isn't it? How easy it is to speak harsh, sarcastic words to those who are continually living with us. We will be as loving and true in dealing with those as with others. The danger is that we keep our niceness for outsiders and our nastiness for our own family, don't we? And that isn't right at all, is it? Home will indeed be a happy place. Not because we're ornamenting it with all kinds of empty words, whether we call our wife dear or darling or whether we don't. That's not the main thing, is it? It's not just a matter of surface love. It's a matter of true love and true appreciation and true understanding. It says in early writings, page 53 and page 55, it talks about the voice of Jesus when he was leading his people. Anyone remember how it describes the voice of Jesus? It says, we then heard Jesus' lovely voice. That's how he commands his people, with a lovely voice. In another place, it calls the voice of Jesus a musical voice. A musical voice. Something that is pleasing to our senses. Something that invites us to loyalty and support for him and obedience. This is the voice of Jesus. Yes, pleasant words are the things that will issue forth from our mouths. These are the things that will inspire willing, loyal response and obedience. Another statement I've got here, page 247 now. It says, let mothers be careful not to make unnecessary requirements to exhibit their own authority before others. Give few commands, but see that these are obeyed. Do not, in your discipline of children, release them from that which you have required them to do. In other words, you ask them to do something, and then you forget you've asked them, and they don't do it, or they do something else. Our commands, our requests, need to be as few as ever possible, and well thought out beforehand. We're not to lash out commands before we've properly thought out what we're asking to be done. We're to give careful thought. And if a command is necessary, then issue it. And if we have issued it, that is to be done. The greatest harm that can be done to children is to allow them to fail to obey our requests. A request spoken lovingly, with cheery words, but it's nevertheless a command and must be obeyed. The greatest damage we could do to is to allow children to fail to carry out what has been requested. It says, do not in your discipline of children release them from that which you have required them to do. Do not let your mind become so absorbed in other things as to cause you to grow careless. And do not become wearied in your guardianship because your children forget and do that which you have forbidden them to do. This is ever so important in various spheres of life. In the selection of our books, we shouldn't take on board every book we see. We should be very careful. We should select few. We should have few, but well chosen. The Bible and the spirit of prophecy need to be the nucleus of those books. Few and well chosen. And even with the Bible and the spirit of prophecy alone, we've got a wealth of learning there that we could never exhaust. I'm not suggesting you don't get other books, but those are basic. And the others need to be carefully selected and thought out. And the same applies in the messages we give to our children. Few, carefully thought out, carefully selected, well chosen, and make sure that they are adhered to. These things are basic in all the lives of our children. There is so much to occupy people's minds and children's lives these days. But we need to make sure that they're not involved in any more of these diversions that Satan has to offer in our world than is absolutely necessary. There is plenty of good, wholesome food for thought, plenty of good, wholesome truth to be understood, plenty of beautiful things of God's nature to be appreciated, without wandering off on the devil's diversions and perversions of truth. It says here in child guidance, and other things to remember, Do not, this is page 245, do not, I beg of you, correct your children in anger. That is the time of all times when you should act with humility and patience and prayer. Then is the time to kneel down with your children and ask the Lord for pardon. Seek to win them to Christ by the manifestation of kindness and love, and you will see that a higher power than that of earth is cooperating with your efforts. Isn't that a wonderful promise? If we do the correcting and the guidance aright, and in the Spirit of Jesus, we will observe that a higher power than the powers of earth is cooperating with us. And we need that, don't we? Or should we say God needs us to cooperate with that higher power? These are the things that make for success with God in training up a child in the way he should go. There's a text in Deuteronomy that I'm sure we're all very well acquainted with. Let's turn to it, shall we? Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verses 6 and 7. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart. Notice I'm going to talk about children. But before it talks about the children, what does it talk about? Us. These words, he says, shall be in your own heart. That comes first. And then what does it say? And thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, when thou walkest by the way, when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. There you've got morning and evening worship at least, haven't you? But more than that, when thou walkest by the way. A particular time, a particular valuable time is the Sabbath afternoon walk, isn't it? When thou walkest in the way. These words we can communicate to our children, to those for whom we feel a sense of responsibility. Oh, so many have not got godly parents that they can be taught. But these are opportunities when we can pass on to them the valuable words of life that are going to make all the difference in their development. When thou risest, when thou sittest in the house, when thou walkest by the way, when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. That's education, isn't it? These words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart. And having got them in your heart, then you'll talk of them at every reasonable opportunity with your children and with others whom God has given you the responsibility of influencing. Yes? It tells us here then in Genesis chapter 18 and verse 19 something about the one whom God chose in a special way to be the head of a household. You can probably already guess who it is we're talking about. In Genesis chapter 18 and verse 19 it says, and God said, for I know him that he will command his children and his household after him. Notice how he puts it again. If he was going to command his household and his children after him, he'd have to have done it first, wouldn't he? He would be training up a child, not telling a child. Of Abraham, I know him, says God. You could put his finger on that man. Say, I know him. I can rely upon him. I can trust him. He's going to train his household and his children after him. And they shall keep the way of the Lord, to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of him. Notice the command and the promise once again. He will keep the way of the Lord. That's the command. And what is the promise? That I may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of. The wonderful promises that he had given to Abraham and his posterity. Abraham was a man who God could truly trust. In actual fact, Abraham was at the stage in his life when he had become the center, the depositor of God's truth for the world. We can trace through the thin red line of godly men, from Adam right down through Shem and Methuselah and Enoch and Noah and through to Shem and then to Abraham. And God looked around in the world, and the world had rapidly become corrupt once again after the flood. But God managed to find one man who he felt something could be done with. And that man was the son of Terah, Abraham. And God chose him out. And he's called the father of the faithful. Through Abraham, he sought to establish a household with a man who could be trusted to train his household aright, to establish a household that could be a pattern for the families of the earth. Whoever wished to take heed and to walk in the ways of the true God. This was God's design for establishing Abraham. He was a man, a home man, and he was made responsible by God for the conversion of the world. Not through a church, but through his home. And this is a thing that we can always remember. God's early efforts for the conversion of mankind were done through the committed home, the home established for Jesus. Oh, how important this is. It has far, far more potential than any other organization. The Christian home. No wonder God says that when the spirit of Elijah is poured out, it will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the children to the fathers. That's what's going to make the difference in the Christian life and in the promotion of the gospel in this world. Furthermore, let's turn on, shall we, to Genesis chapter 26 and verse 5. A bit farther on in the history of Abraham, God has said already that I know him, that he'll keep my commandments. And here he says he's done it. Because that Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Yes, Abraham actually carried it out. Let me read to you from Patriarchs and Prophets. This time, page 142. How few there are in our day who follow the example of Abraham. On the part of too many parents, there is a blind and selfish sentimentalism miscalled love, which is manifested in leaving children with their unformed judgment and undisciplined passions to the control of their own will. This is almost universal in our world today. Men go off feelings and impressions instead of having a will to know what is the right. And it says, this is the veriest cruelty to the youth and is a great wrong to the world. Parental indulgence causes disorder in families and in society. It confirms in the young the desire to follow inclination instead of submitting to the divine requirements. Thus they grow up with a heart averse to doing God's will, and they transmit their irreligious, insubordinate spirit to their children and their children's children. Like Abraham, parents should command their households after them. Let obedience to parental authority be taught and enforced as the first step in obedience to the authority of God. Another statement here I'm going to read to you now from Patriarchs and Prophets, page 125 this time. After the dispersion from Babel, idolatry again became well nigh universal, and the Lord finally left the hardened transgressors to follow their evil ways, while he chose Abraham of the line of Shem and made him the keeper of his law for future generations. Abraham had grown up in the midst of superstition and heathenism. Even his father's household, by whom the knowledge of God had been preserved. See, Abraham had been brought up in a household that professed to follow the true God. The household of Abraham was like the Laodicean church. It says here, even his father's household, by whom the knowledge of God had been preserved, were yielding to the seductive influences surrounding them, and they served other gods than Jehovah. But the true faith was not to become extinct. God has ever preserved a remnant to serve him. In few times they have been much maligned and misrepresented, but they have nevertheless been preserved by God. Adam, Seth, Enoch, Methuselah, Noah, Shem, in unbroken line, had preserved from age to age the precious revealings of his will. And now the son of Terah that's Abraham, became the inheritor of this holy trust. That word Terah, by the way, means tarry. And that's exactly what had happened in the experience of Abraham's father. It says, in idolatry invited him, Abraham, on every side, but in vain. Faithful among the faithless, uncorrupted by the prevailing apostasy, he steadfastly adhered to the worship of the one true God. The Lord is nigh unto all them that call upon them, and that call upon him in truth. That was Abraham's experience. Genesis 12, verse 1. Now the Lord had said unto Abraham, or Abram, he was called at this point, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. God called Abraham out from his kindred. Had he stayed there in constant contact with his family, God couldn't have used him in the mighty way he purposed to do. And so he called him out. And we know, of course, that Abraham did go out. And he went out not knowing whither he went, we're told. But God said, get thee out. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 126, tells us, the message of God came to Abraham, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee, in order that God might qualify him for his great work as the keeper of the sacred oracles. Abraham must be separated from the associations of his early life. The influence of kindred and friends would interfere with the training which the Lord purposed to give his servant. Now that Abraham was, in a special sense, connected with heaven, he must dwell among strangers. His character must be peculiar, differing from all the world. He could not even explain his course of action so as to be understood by his friends. Spiritual things are spiritually discerned, and his motives and actions were not comprehended by his idolatrous kindred, that's his relatives. It was no light test that was thus brought upon Abraham, no small sacrifice that was required of him. There were strong ties to bind him to his country, his kindred and his home, but he did not hesitate to obey the call. He had no question to ask concerning the land of promise, whether the soil was fertile, whether the climate was healthful, whether the country offered agreeable surroundings and would afford opportunities for amassing wealth. God had spoken, and his servant must obey. The happiest place on earth for him was the place where God would have him to be. That's the life of Abraham. What a wonderful life it was. And to help us see how that worked out, Patriarchs and Prophets, page 141, tells us, it was a wise arrangement which God himself had made to cut off his people so far as possible from connection with the heathen, making them a people dwelling alone and not reckoned among the nations. He had separated Abraham from his idolatrous kindred, that the patriarch might train and educate his family apart from the seductive influences which would have surrounded them in Mesopotamia, and that the true faith might be preserved in its purity by his descendants from generation to generation. It was necessary that God would separate him in that way. And when we are linked up with worldly influences and worldly relatives, we are bound around by the, as it puts it in the spirit of prophecy, by the silken cords of filial affection. God called Abraham out from it. You know, even we in our churches, our dear church, we're warned that amongst us there is not 1 in 20 who are any different from the common sinner in the world. Not 1 in 20. Right. We may wish to support our church, yes. But how careful we have to be that we're not influenced, as would Abraham have been in the Laodicean church of his relatives, that had been affected by worldly influences. Genesis chapter 13 and verse 2, you'd think Abraham had set course on a terribly difficult pathway, wouldn't you? What does it say was the result of this? Genesis, what was it? Genesis chapter 13 and verse 2. And Abraham was very rich in cattle, in silver, and in gold. What do you think of that? He became very rich. The Lord blessed and prospered him. You would have thought, setting out with funny ideas, as many would call it, and a funny way of going on, that he would have been sticking himself out, sticking his neck out, as it were, and be in danger of getting it chopped off. But no, God blessed him and prospered him. and he became really wealthy. Not that that's the reason we should serve God, and that was not the reason why Abraham did, was it? But he became wealthy as a result. God blessed. Child Guidance, page 288. Child Guidance, page 288. Be careful how you relinquish the government of your children to others. No one can properly relieve you of your God-given responsibility. Many children have been utterly ruined by the interference of relatives or friends in their home government. Mothers should never allow their sisters or mothers to interfere with the wise management of their children. Although the mother may have received the very best training at the hands of her mother, yet in 9 cases out of 10, as a grandmother, she would spoil her daughter's children by indulgence and injudicious praise. That's something for us to take note of, isn't it? Men and women, all the patient effort of the mother may be undone by this course of treatment. It is proverbial that grandparents, as a rule, are unfit to bring up their grandchildren. What do you think of that? Don't say that every grandparent, a truly converted grandparent, will deal aright, but generally speaking, even though grandparents have been strict with their children, they'll be lax and spoil their grandchildren. And it says, men and women should pay all the respect and deference due to their parents. See, this is the rule. Pay all the respect and deference due to your parents. But watch the influence that they can have on you or your children. Take very great care. It says, but in the matter of the management of their own children, they should allow no interference, but hold the reins of government in their own hands. And it goes on to say here, wherever I go, I am pained by the neglect of proper home discipline and restraint. Little children are permitted to answer back, to manifest disrespect and impertinence, using language that no child should ever be permitted to his superiors. Parents who permit the use of unbecoming language are more worthy of blame than their children. Impertinence should not be tolerated in a child even once. But fathers and mothers, uncles and aunts and grandparents laugh at the exhibition of passion in the little creature of a year old. Its imperfect utterance of disrespect, its childish stubbornness are thought to be clever and cunning. Thus wrong habits are confirmed, and the child grows up to be an object of dislike to all around him. I tremble, especially for our mothers, as I see them so blind and feeling so little the responsibilities that devolve upon a mother. They see Satan working in the self-willed child of even but a few months of age. Filled with spiteful passion, Satan seems to be taking full possession. But there may be in the house perhaps a grandmother, an aunt, or some other relative or friend who will seek to make that parent believe that it would be cruelty to correct that child, whereas just the opposite is true. And it is the greatest cruelty to let Satan have the possession of that tender, helpless child. Satan must be rebuked. Hold on to the child. His hold on the child must be broken. If correction is needed, be faithful and true. The love of God, true pity for the child, will lead to the faithful discharge of duty. And what about, should we spank a child? What does it say in the scripture? Yeah. He that spareth the rod hateth his child. That's the text, isn't it? He that spareth the rod hateth his child. Yeah, all right. Doesn't even say he that spareth the rod doesn't love his child. It said he hateth his child. Does that mean to say we should be spanking them all the time? No. What should we do then? It obviously endorses punishment, but let's just read what it says here in Child Guidance, page 250. The mother may ask, shall I never punish my child? Whipping may be necessary when other resources fail, yet she should not use the rod if it is possible to avoid doing so. If milder measures prove insufficient, punishment that will bring the child to its senses should in love be administered. Frequently, one such correction will be enough for a lifetime. See? We're not to bring children up on smacks and that sort of thing. If they've been taught to obey a word, that won't be necessary anyway. But frequently, one such correction is enough to show the child that he does not hold the lines of control. And when this step becomes necessary, the child should be seriously impressed with the thought that this is not done for the gratification of the parent or to indulge arbitrary authority, but for the child's own good. He should be taught that every fault uncorrected will bring unhappiness to himself and will displease God. Under such discipline, children will find their greatest happiness in submitting their wills to the will of their Heavenly Father. Desire of Ages, page 74. Speaking of Jesus, it says, Jesus shunned display. During all the years of his stay in Nazareth, he made no exhibition of his miraculous power. He sought no high position and assumed no titles. His quiet and simple life, and even the silence of the scriptures concerning his early years, teach an important lesson. The more quiet and simple the life of the child, the more free from artificial excitement, and the more in harmony with nature, the more favorable it is to physical and mental vigor and spiritual strength. Quietness. It's not necessary for children to be making a racket. That's not necessary at all. And we're told that in a number of other places, in the spirit of prophecy, as well as in the scriptures. Child Guidance, page 97, says, Fathers and mothers, teach your children that they must be subordinate to law. Do not allow them to think that because they are children, it is their privilege to make all the noise they wish in the house. Wise rules and regulations must be made and enforced, that the beauty of the home life may not be spoiled. Parents do their children great wrong when they allow them to scream and cry. They should not be allowed to be careless and boisterous. If these objectionable traits of character are not checked in their early years, the children will take them with them and strengthened and developed into religious and business life. Children will be just as happy if they are taught to be quiet in the house. The Sabbath school and the morning meeting for worship occupy only a part of the Sabbath. The portion remaining to the family may be made the most sacred and precious season of all the Sabbath hours. Much of this time parents should spend with their children. In the out of doors, it goes on to say, if possible. And so there's a thing that is important. It also tells us here that parents, above everything, take care of your children upon the Sabbath. Do not suffer them to violate God's holy day by playing in the house or out of doors. The ordinary playthings that they're playing within the week, they're all put away on Sabbath, aren't they? Yes. And only things that are suitable for Sabbath, they will be handling at that time. And no ball playing or anything like that. You may just as well break the Sabbath as yourselves. as to let your children do it. And when you suffer your children to wander about and suffer them to play upon the Sabbath, God looks upon you as a Sabbath breaker. Well, we're getting as I'm having to curtail a few of these remarks now, but let me just point out a few important things in closing. Child Guidance, page 542. The moral taste of the worshippers in God's holy sanctuary must be elevated, refined, and sanctified. This matter has been sadly neglected. Its importance has been overlooked, and as a result, disorder and irreverence have become prevalent, and God has been dishonored. When the leaders in the church, ministers and people, fathers and mothers, have not had elevated views on this matter, what could be expected of the inexperienced children? They are too often found in groups, away from the parents who should have charge of them, notwithstanding that they are in the presence of God, and His eye is looking upon them. They are light and trifling. They whisper and laugh, are careless, irreverent, and inattentive. So this is something that we need to watch, isn't it? In the assemblies of the saints, it says in Psalm 89 and verse 7 that God is to be greatly feared in the assemblies of His saints. How important that we bear this in mind in the conduct of our children and the way they are looked after. Child Guidance, page 544, it says, your child should be taught to obey as the children of God obey. If this standard is maintained, a word from you will have some weight when your child is restless in the house of God. How have we trained our children to have respect to our word, uttered lovingly, quietly? And if we've done it in everyday life, it will work in the house of God. A child can be taught to sit quietly, either on your knee or by you, in the house of God. And it is not any great difficulty if proper training has been followed. This is ever so important. And it says, but if the children cannot be restrained, if the parents feel that the restraint is too much of an exaction, the child should be removed from the church at once. It should not be left to divert the minds of the hearers by talking or running about. God is dishonored by the loose way in which parents manage their children while at church. So that's something else for us to think of, isn't it? The training of our children should be such that they will behave reverently and happily with us in God's house, in the house of Jesus, as we can put it to them. A final quotation from Child Guidance, page 567. It says, we see a retinue of angels on either side of the gate, that's the heavenly gate, and as we pass in, Jesus speaks, come, ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom that is prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Here he tells you to be a partaker of his joy. And what is that? It is the joy of seeing of the travail of your soul, fathers. It is the joy of seeing that your efforts, mothers, are rewarded. Here are your children. The crown of life is upon their heads, and the angels of God immortalize the names of the mothers whose efforts have won their children to Jesus Christ. This is how we will view a child, a potential candidate for the children of God. It says, with joy unutterable, parents can see the crown, the robe, the harp given to their children. The days of hope and fear are ended. The seeds sown with tears and prayers may have seemed to be sowed in vain, but their harvest is reaped with joy at last. Their children have been redeemed. Mothers and fathers, Shall the voices of your children swell the song of gladness in that great day? When we hear the voice of Jesus, shall it be, thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting, or shall it be, well done, good and faithful servant? Thou hast been faithful over a few things, I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord.